So have you ever gone cruising the gut? Showing off your car, going out to see and be seen? Cruising the gut was a popular activity from the 1950s through the 1980s, and that's what I'm going to talk about today and whatever happened to it. Stay tuned. Hi, my name is Ms. Jen Exodus, and today we're going to talk about cruising culture and whatever happened to cruising the gut and why teenagers don't still do that today. Welcome. Cruising the gut was a popular pastime from the 1950s through the 1980s, where teenagers all across America would get together and show off their cars on Friday and Saturday night, driving up and down the main street of whatever town they happened to live in. There was a movie that was released in 1974 called American Graffiti, and it was centered around this kind of socializing, cruising culture that existed at the time. It's a great movie. You should go check it out. I've got a link in the description where you can get that online. Cruising the gut was actually outlawed in the 1980s in most American cities, and there was a lot of reasons why it happened. I actually have an article here that a gentleman posted on Reddit, Oregon Guy 1954. He posted an article about cruising the gut in Eugene, Oregon. I am in Portland, Oregon, so a little bit different, but still close enough. One of the biggest complaints that people had was traffic congestion, and that makes sense. The whole goal wasn't to go fast, it was to go slow. It was not a drag racing kind of event, for sure. Certainly not like what the kids are doing today with their hot rods and muscle cars, with their intersection takeovers and doing the burnout contests and the drifting contests. It was a lot more social and interactive. Usually one person had a car, 3 or 4 of their friends would ride along, and you would go up and down the street looking to see where the parties are going to be and where everybody's meeting up later. Traffic congestion became a serious problem at a lot of cities, and the police started limiting the number of times that a car could pass by the same station in one day. Then there were the noise complaints. Whether it's revving engines or people just being rowdy, or in the 80s, we started getting the really loud thumping stereos. That was another thing that was really starting to annoy the neighbors in the areas where cruising was most typically happening. There were also public safety concerns. I mean, a lot of kids drank, but I could see how that could be a problem. You know, teenagers drinking leads to teenagers fighting and teenagers doing stupid shit. So I totally get it. And then there was just the simple cleaning up after a busy night of cruising. Teenagers aren't the best at cleaning up after themselves. Trash and garbage, as if some kind of parade had come through. Public workers that need to come out and clean up the streets during these or after these events. Eventually, the events were getting so busy that, you know, what was a couple hundred cars driving up and down the street became thousands of cars on some nights, and police were completely overwhelmed. There was just not enough police for the number of people who were attending. Portland, Oregon outlawed cruising in 1985. Eugene, Oregon outlawed it in 1988. I do remember we're getting so busy that, you know, what was a couple hundred cars driving up and down the street became thousands of cars on some nights, and police were completely overwhelmed. There was just not enough police for the number of people who were attending every weekend, Friday and Saturday night cruising events. So it got really hard for the cops. And then, of course, there is the final reason, and it's really probably the first reason, is that downtowns in most of America in the mid-20th century had really gotten hollowed out. And there was a big political push to revitalize downtowns and bring new businesses downtowns. But the activities of cruising were making it difficult for restaurants and bars and venues to attract customers because there was no parking, the traffic was too heavy. It was disruptive of business. So cruising was disruptive of business, and therefore most cities outlawed. And then that was the end of cruising culture in America. teenagers would have to find other ways to keep themselves occupied on the weekends. So I read an article on Reddit that was written by a gentleman. He had written the article to submit. He didn't say which newspaper, but I'm guessing it was the Eugene Weekly, which is the alternative newspaper there in Eugene, about what it was like cruising the gut. The author's name is Oregon Guy 1954. And he says, here's an article I wrote for a local magazine, but was rejected because they already had published something on the topic. And the title of the article is Dragging the Gut. No one knows exactly when it started, but beginning in the late 1950s, South Willamette Street was extra busy on Friday and Saturday nights. Young people cruised up and down, turned around at the A&W root beer restaurant on the southeast corner of 29th and Willamette, returned north to the one-way zone, then up to Oak Street until they decided at any point along the way to turn left again back to Willamette for another time around. They did it, they said, to see and be seen by whomever else might be there. It was a place to meet people, share the latest gossip, admire each other's cars, and maybe be invited to parties that were starting over in town. By 1969, the Gut was attracting about 2,500 young people each weekend. The Register-Guard newspaper dispatched one of its top journalists, Dan Szilard, to ride along with some of the cruisers and to report on what he learned. Upon emerging from the experience, Szilard's reaction was quite positive. He found that the drivers to be polite. They waited patiently as others changed lanes or merged into traffic. They didn't race. They didn't think anybody should race on the city streets. Szilard's hosts and hostesses happily exchanged gossip about all the things that interest them and waved at friends and simply had a good time. At this point, the cruisers and the city were getting along quite well when there was talk of blockading certain intersections to make cruising more difficult. Many of the city actually stood up for the kids, saying that they needed to have fun and they weren't really doing anything wrong. At that time, even the police saw the Gut as a relatively harmless thing, but that was to change as cruisers began coming from out of town, significantly raising the numbers of those participating. And starting about the mid-1970s, incidents had been on the rise that were rare in the 1960s. Fights became more numerous and more dangerous as weapons sometimes appeared. Cases of public intoxication and public urination increased. There were stormy confrontations by the cruisers with local residents and business owners. Demands upon the police grew until officers were asked to work overtime to help maintain order. Upon hearing enough complaints, the city leaders decided to crack down. One effort to compromise involved moving the cruisers to West 11th, but that plan didn't please everyone either. In early 1988, the Eugene City Council passed an anti-cruising ordinance. The result? Instant success. Not a single citation needed to be written. The word had spread, and after almost 30 years of regular activity, dragging the Gut was no more. Occasionally, there were efforts by some to revive the lost tradition, but these were met with strong opposition and did not last long. The story of the Gut in Eugene, then, is a tale of two eras. In one, it seemed that a good-natured young person drove up and down the street, calling to one another, admiring their cars, listening to their music, supported by the city leaders and police. In the other, they were engaged in what a 1988 Register-Guard editorial termed rowdy, obnoxious, and sometimes downright criminal behavior. The traditions of one generation do not always pass gracefully on to the next. In this case, dragging the Gut had lost its charm and needed to stop. But for those who got to go along for the ride, in either era or in both, the Gut will always have some special memories. So do you remember cruising the Gut? Anyhow, tell me about your cruising experiences and if you enjoyed it or if you thought it was a nuisance and you really wish they would go away and find something else to keep themselves occupied with. I would love to hear about it. My name is Ms. Jen Exodus, and thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.